Lucy Donnelly said the words on a Wednesday evening, and James Dunlap felt them land in his chest like a blade finding the space between two ribs, not the killing blow, but the kind that made every breath afterward remind you exactly where the wound was. She stood in the doorway of the ranch house, her worn leather traveling bag hanging from her right hand, the strap cutting into her fingers the way a decision cuts into a person before they have even fully made it. The lantern on the porch threw a warm amber light across her face, and it made the whole scene feel cruelly beautiful, the kind of beauty that happens right before something breaks. "I cannot promise you I will stay, James," she said. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight, and Lucy Donnelly had spent enough years keeping her jaw tight to know how much effort that took. "I need you to understand that. I'm not a woman who can make that promise." James stood 10 feet back from her, his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way he did when he was fighting every instinct he had. He was not a man who begged. He was not a man who made speeches. He had spent 31 years on the high plains of Wyoming territory learning that the land did not reward a man for what he wanted, only for what he was willing to work for. "Then I will keep making it worth staying," he said. Those 7 words hung in the summer air between them, somewhere between a vow and a dare, somewhere between love and the most heartbreaking kind of faith a person could extend to another. Lucy stared at him. She had expected argument. She had expected ultimatum. Lord knew she had received enough of those from men who thought that wanting her gave them the right to own her. She had not expected that. She had not expected him to take her warning and turn it into a promise pointed entirely at himself. Her fingers tightened on the bag strap. And the story of how Lucy Donnelly came to be standing in that doorway with a bag in her hand, and a rancher's impossible patience spread out before her like an open plain, that story had begun 8 months earlier, in the autumn of 1883, on a day when the Wyoming wind came down from the mountains cold enough to make a person feel like they had made every wrong choice in their life simultaneously. She had arrived in Carver's Creek on the afternoon stage from Cheyenne, sitting in the far corner of the coach with her bag wedged between her knees and her eyes fixed on the window, so that the other passengers would not try to speak with her. She was 26 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that had been called pretty so many times by people with ulterior motives that she had come to treat the word as a form of warning. She was dressed practically brown wool traveling dress, sturdy boots, a coat that had seen better winters, and she carried with her a small leather satchel that held everything she owned of value, which amounted to $17 in coin, a folding knife, a letter of reference from a seamstress in St. Louis, and a photograph of her mother, who had been dead for 4 years. She had no plan beyond the next week. That was the way Lucy Donnelly had lived for the past 3 years, ever since she had walked out of a bad situation in Kansas City, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the understanding that she was entirely on her own in the world, which was terrifying and also, in certain quiet moments, clarifying. Carver's Creek was a small cattle town in the southeastern corner of Wyoming territory, the kind of place that existed because the railroad had come through and because cattle needed to go somewhere. It had a main street of sun-bleached wooden storefronts, a livery, a hotel that was also a saloon, a church, a dry goods store, and a school that was only open for half the year because the schoolteacher had left the previous spring to marry a man in Denver, and no one had replaced her yet. The population was perhaps 300 souls, though most of the ranchers and their hands lived out on the range and came to town only when they needed to. Lucy stepped off the stage and stood for a moment in the afternoon light, taking stock of the place the way she always took stock of a new place: exits, resources, tone. She had learned to read a town the way some women read embroidery patterns, quickly, and with attention to what was likely to unravel. She needed work. She had been told in Cheyenne, by a woman named Martha Greer who ran a boarding house and who had taken a kindness to Lucy over 2 days of shared meals, that there might be work in Carver's Creek. The general store owner, a Mr. Elias Holt, had advertised in the Cheyenne paper for someone to help in the store and to do accounts, and Martha had thought Lucy's head for numbers might serve her. The general store was the second building on the left. Lucy walked to it directly, because the alternative was standing in the street looking lost, and Lucy Donnelly had not looked lost in public since she was 23. Elias Holt was a round, red-faced man of about 50 who looked at Lucy over his spectacles with the particular expression of a man reassessing his expectations. He had clearly been expecting someone different, perhaps a widow of middle years, perhaps someone who came with a husband attached. He had not been expecting a young woman alone, with sharp eyes and no apology in her posture. But he needed the help, and Lucy's references were good, and she could add a column of numbers faster than he could blink. He hired her that afternoon for room, board, and $12 a month, which was not generous but was fair by the standards of a small frontier town in 1883. She moved into the small room behind the store and began to learn Carver's Creek the way she learned every new place, carefully, systematically, with the specific kind of watchfulness that comes from having been surprised badly before. James Dunlap came into the general store on her third day. She knew who he was before he told her, because in a town of 300 people, a man who owns the largest cattle operation in the county leaves a certain impression in conversation before he ever walks through a door. She had heard his name from Elias Holt, from the blacksmith's wife who came in for thread, from 2 different cowboys who had stopped at the store counter and talked around her as though she were part of the shelving. James Dunlap. The Dunlap spread. A good man, they all said, in the particular way that Western people said good man, meaning he was honest and he was fair and he worked hard and he did not cheat anyone. It was the highest compliment the frontier offered. He was tall and lean in the way that men who work outdoors in hard weather get lean, not thin, but stripped of anything unnecessary. He had dark hair going silver at the temples and brown eyes that were the exact color of creek water in October, and he had the hands of a man who had been working cattle since he was a boy, scarred and calloused and competent. He was 31 years old. He had never been married. He came to the store for fencing wire and lamp oil and a sack of dried beans, and Lucy helped him find what he needed with the same brisk efficiency she applied to everything, and he thanked her with a directness that was so different from the sideways appreciation she usually received from men in stores that she looked at him twice. He noticed her looking twice. He did not make anything of it in the moment. He paid for his goods, tipped his hat, and left, but he came back 4 days later for things that, in Lucy's professional assessment, he did not particularly need. He came back the week after that as well, and the week after that. Elias Holt noticed. He said nothing, but his eyes went between them with a particular quality of noticing. The first time James Dunlap spoke to Lucy beyond the transaction of commerce, it was over a stuck jar lid. He had come in on a Saturday afternoon when the store was briefly empty of other customers, and there was a large jar of preserved peaches on the counter that a rancher's wife had sent back because she could not get the lid off. Lucy had been working at it for 10 minutes. James watched her struggle with it for approximately 3 seconds, then set down his hat and said, "May I?" She handed it over. He opened it in one turn. She looked at him with a level expression and said, "Show off." He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from genuine surprise, the kind that a person does not perform. And something shifted in the air between them, small and fragile, like the first ice of a creek that you are not entirely sure will hold your weight. They talked for 20 minutes that afternoon, not about anything of consequence, the weather, the state of the roads, a book she mentioned she had been reading. But James Dunlap listened the way very few people listened, with his full attention, as though what she was saying was actually the most interesting thing available to him at that moment. Lucy was not used to that. She was used to men who listened for the pause where they could begin speaking about themselves. She was careful. She was always careful, but she found herself looking for his wagon on the street in the mornings when she swept the front step of the store. She found herself, in the evenings, thinking about things she might say to him if he came in tomorrow. That was a warning sign she recognized, but did not immediately act on. The true beginning, the moment that would later anchor everything, including the conversation in the doorway, came in November, 6 weeks after Lucy had arrived in Carver's Creek, on a night when the temperature dropped to something that felt like the land itself was trying to be rid of everyone on it. She had been walking back from delivering a package to the hotel for Elias when the storm came in from the north so fast that the sky went from gray to black in the time it took to cross one street. The wind came with it, sharp and vicious, the kind of Wyoming wind that finds every gap in a coat and makes it its business. Lucy was half a block from the store when the ice began, not snow but sleet, small hard pellets that hit exposed skin like thrown gravel. She ran, but the wooden sidewalk was already turning treacherous, and she went down hard on one knee at the corner, catching herself on her palms on the frozen boards. She got up fast, the way pride demands, and found James Dunlap's hand at her elbow. He had been coming out of the hardware store across the street and had seen her fall and crossed over at something between a walk and a run. He steadied her without making a production of it, and when she said she was fine, he looked at her scraped palms and said simply, "Let me walk you." He walked her to the store. He waited while she unlocked the door. He asked before he left if she had wood enough for the stove, and when she said she thought so, he said he would bring extra over in the morning because the storm was going to be bad and Elias' woodpile was on the short side. He did bring it the next morning. And that evening, because the storm had knocked out the heat in the small room behind the store where Lucy slept, Elias Holt moved her temporarily into his own family's house above the store, and James Dunlap came by to make sure the situation had been resolved, and he stayed for supper because Mrs. Holt insisted, and he and Lucy sat across a kitchen table from each other for the first time, with lamplight between them and the storm howling outside, and they talked until the Holt children fell asleep on the parlor floor. She told him nothing about Kansas City. She told him nothing about the years before that, about the dark past that had made her so careful, made her so determined never to plant roots deep enough that they could be used to hold her in place. But she told him about St. Louis. She told him about learning to sew from a French seamstress who had fled New Orleans. She told him about her mother, who had been a school teacher in Ohio, and how she had read to Lucy every night until Lucy was old enough to read herself, and then they had read to each other. James told her about coming to Wyoming from Illinois at the age of 19, with $20 and a horse and an absolute refusal to go back. He told her about the first winter, which had nearly killed him, and the second winter, which had come close, and how by the third winter he had begun to understand that the land would not conform to you. You had to learn its terms and work within them. He told her about building the ranch house with his own hands and a neighbor's help, about the first cattle he had bought with borrowed money and paid back in 18 months, about the way the spread looked in the early morning when the light came over the eastern ridge and turned everything gold for exactly 20 minutes. He did not tell her, not that night, about the loneliness. But she heard it anyway, in the precise way he described having built that house, in the single use of the word we that he corrected to I without explanation. She drove home alone through the storm that night, not literally, because she was already in the Holt's house, but the feeling of walking toward something you are not sure about, that feeling followed her into sleep. December came. The courtship, if you could call it that, was slow and careful in the way that both of them were slow and careful about anything that mattered. He came to the store more than he needed to. They talked. One Sunday afternoon he asked if she would like to see the ranch, and she said yes, because she was curious about the place he had described with such particular love. He drove her out in a wagon on a clear, cold Sunday, the kind of Wyoming December day where the sky is so blue it seems to be making a statement. The Dunlap spread was 3 miles east of town, 600 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through the southern edge, and the mountains visible to the north and west like a promise the sky had made and kept. The ranch house was low and solid, built of timber and stone, with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. There were two large barns, a bunkhouse for the hands, a kitchen garden that had been put to sleep for winter, and at the south edge of the property, a small cluster of cottonwood trees along the creek bank that had gone gold before the leaves fell and left their skeletons reaching into the blue sky. Lucy stood at the fence and looked at all of it and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Later she would understand that it was longing, not for the ranch specifically, though it was beautiful, but for the permanence of it, the way something that someone had built with intention and care could stand in a landscape and declare that it intended to remain. She had not felt that particular longing since she was a girl, before the world had taught her that permanence was a story people told to comfort themselves. "It is beautiful," she said, and she meant it entirely. He watched her face while she said it, and she caught him watching, and neither of them looked away immediately. The cold air turned their breath to small clouds between them, and the creek moved under its shelf of ice, and somewhere in one of the cottonwoods a hawk called once and then was silent. James drove her back to town. He said, before she got down from the wagon, that he would very much like to take her to supper at the hotel dining room the following Saturday if she was willing. His voice was even, but his jaw was set the way it got when he was prepared for an answer he did not want to receive. Lucy said yes, and then she went inside the store and stood in the back room and had a brief, silent argument with herself about what she was doing. The supper was the first of 6. One every Saturday through December and into January. The hotel dining room was Carver's Creek's best effort at elegant linen tablecloths, a piano that needed tuning, a limited menu that was nevertheless real food prepared with care. They talked across those tables with the particular intensity of two people who have both spent a long time being careful about what they say and are beginning to find that carefulness frustrating. On the fourth supper, in the second week of January 1884, she let something slip. They had been talking about a family in town, the Reeves family, whose patriarch had a reputation for meanness toward his wife that people generally pretended not to know about, and Lucy said something sharper than she had intended, something that came from a place too personal to have been purely abstract, and she saw James register it. His eyes changed. He did not ask. He waited. She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "I was in a situation once that was difficult to leave." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "But you left." "Yes." "Then you were brave," he said, and the directness of it, the complete absence of pity or of prurient curiosity, undid something in her chest that had been tied tight for a long time. She did not tell him everything that night, but she began. Over the course of those 6 suppers and the cold afternoons in between, Lucy told James Dunlap the shape of the dark past she had been carrying. Not all at once, and not easily, but piece by piece, the way you test ice, pressing one foot forward, checking for the crack, then pressing further. She had grown up in Ohio, as she had said. Her father had died when she was 12. Her mother had kept them going by teaching, and Lucy had been a good student, and at 17 she had gone to work as a seamstress in Cleveland. At 22, she had made the catastrophic mistake of believing a man named Caulfield Mercer, who was charming in the specific way that a trap is charming, by appearing to be something else entirely. She had married Caulfield Mercer in 1880 in Cleveland, and had understood within 6 months that she had bound herself to a man who believed that marriage was a form of ownership, and that whatever he chose to do with his property was between him and God. He was not the first man in the Wild West era to hold this view. The law agreed with him, largely. It was the sort of injustice so deeply embedded in the structures of everyday life that most people simply called it normal. But Lucy Donnelly was not a woman who accommodated normal when normal was wrong. She was patient. She had learned patience the hard way, and she was strategic. And in the spring of 1882, When Caulfield Mercer went to Cincinnati for 2 weeks on business, Lucy took $17 she had saved coin by coin over a year of careful concealment, packed what she could carry, and left. She had not been home since. She had not contacted anyone who might tell him where she was. She had moved west in stages, St. Louis, then Cheyenne, then Carver's Creek, always keeping her options open, always keeping her bag light enough to pick up and go. James listened to all of this across a dining room table on a cold January night, and his face did a number of things during the telling, but what it never did was flinch away from her. When she finished, or when she had given him enough to understand the outline, which was not quite the same thing, he said, "Is he looking for you?" "I do not know," she said honestly. "I do not think he is looking very hard. His pride would not survive the spectacle of a public search, but I do not know." "Are you still legally bound to him?" "Technically," she said, with the particular flatness of a woman who had made her peace with an unfair world. "Wyoming territory has a divorce law. I looked into it. I would need to have lived here for a year to file." James was quiet for a while. He turned his coffee cup on its saucer. Then he said, "I want you to know that nothing you have just told me changes anything for me about who I understand you to be." She looked at him steadily. "You should know it before you say something like that." "I know enough," he said. And he met her eyes and held them, and Lucy felt the particular vertigo of being seen by someone who was not frightened by what they saw. She walked home from that supper in the January cold and stood outside the store and looked up at the stars over Wyoming, which are extravagant in a way that stars in cities never are, and she thought with great clarity that she was in serious trouble. Not the bad kind. The terrifying, inconvenient, life-altering kind. She was falling in love with James Dunlap. And she did not know what to do with that, because the entire apparatus of her survival for the past 2 years had been built on the premise that she would not let herself do exactly that. February brought a thaw and then another freeze, and then, in the middle of the month, a particular drama that Carver's Creek would talk about for years. A man named Boyd Creel, who ran a small operation east of town and had a long-running feud with a neighboring rancher over a disputed water right, came into the general store where Lucy was working alone and demanded, in the specific way that drunk men demand things on cold mornings, that she sell him an amount of ammunition that was both excessive and alarming. Lucy looked at him over the counter with the absolute stillness she had developed over years of dealing with men who thought loud and threatening was the same as powerful. She said she would sell him what the store was authorized to sell, which was 2 boxes, and that was what she sold him. He argued. She did not move or raise her voice. He slammed his money on the counter and left, and Lucy locked the door after him and went to find Elias Holt, because while she was not afraid of drunk men in the broad sense, she was also not an idiot. James heard about it that afternoon, the way things traveled in a small town, and came to check on her. She told him she was fine, which she was. He looked at her for a moment with something complicated in his eyes and said, "I know you can handle yourself. I just needed to see for myself that you were all right." The distinction he was making between her capability and his need was not lost on her. She let him stay for the better part of an hour, and they talked, and when he left he did something he had not done before. He put his hand briefly, lightly, on her shoulder as he went past, and the warmth of it stayed with her for the rest of the day. Boyd Creel's drama resolved itself without bloodshed, to everyone's relief, when the disputed water right was settled in court in Cheyenne the following week, and he did not need the ammunition for the purpose everyone had feared. March brought the real thaw, the one that smelled like mud and possibility. The world turned green around the edges, and the ranch lands came alive with the urgent business of spring cattle work, and James Dunlap was occupied from before dawn until after dark with calving and the 1,000 tasks that piled up after a long winter. He came to town less. Lucy felt his absence as a specific texture in the days, which told her something she had already known but was still working on accepting. He sent a note with one of his hands. a young cowboy named Pete Albright who delivered it with enormous self-consciousness, and then tried to disappear through the floor. The note was brief and practical in the way that James was brief and practical, and it said that spring work would keep him close to the ranch for several weeks, and he hoped she was well, and there was a pause in the note that she could feel even through the writing, and then it said he found himself thinking about the conversations they had been having, and that he hoped to have more of them soon. Lucy read the note twice, folded it, and wrote back. She told Pete Albright to deliver her reply, which was brief and also, though she would not have described it this way, somewhat warmer than it strictly needed to be. They exchanged 3 more notes over the month of March. Hers became incrementally less guarded with each one. His became incrementally more specific about feelings he was typically precise about not expressing. In the 4th note, he asked if she would come out to the ranch on the first Sunday of April when the calving would be mostly done. He wanted to show her the creek in spring, which was different, he said, from the creek in winter. She went. The creek in spring was entirely different. It ran full and loud over stones that had been locked in ice for months, and there were wildflowers on the bank, the early ones, the ones that came up still stubborn while there was snow in the shadows, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to leaf out in that new green that is almost yellow, electric with the novelty of being alive again. They walked along the creek bank and James showed her where a pair of Canada geese had taken up residence in the reeds on the south bend, and they stood and watched the geese for a while in the easy silence of people who have become comfortable enough with each other to not need to fill the space with words. Then he said, "Lucy," just her name. And she turned and looked at him and he said, "I would like to tell you something, and I want you to know that I am not saying it to create an obligation or a pressure. I want to say it because it is true and because you deserve to have true things said to you plainly." She watched him. Her heart was doing something complicated. "I love you," he said. "I have been working towards saying that for 3 months, and I realize that is probably obvious to everyone except possibly me, but I wanted to say it directly because you are someone who deserves directness." The creek moved. A goose called. The new leaves in the cottonwoods trembled in the April air. Lucy was quiet for long enough that she saw something flicker behind his eyes, the careful management of a man who had laid himself open and was now waiting to see what the world would do with the vulnerability. She knew that feeling. She understood it down to the bone. "I need to tell you something too," she said. And then she told him the thing she had been most afraid to tell him. Not about Caulfield Mercer, he knew about that, but about herself. About the way she was built, or had rebuilt herself to be, in the years since she had walked out of that Cleveland house with $17. She told him that she did not know if she was capable of staying. That she had learned to live like a person who might need to leave at any moment, and that she was not sure she could unlearn that. She told him that she did not want to make him a promise she was not certain she could keep, because she had been made false promises and she knew what they cost. She told him that she was afraid, not of him, not specifically, but of the way love could become a cage if the wrong things went wrong, and that she had been in a cage before, and she had gotten out once, and she did not know if she would be strong enough to get out twice. She said it all quickly, without looking at the creek or the geese or the cottonwoods, looking at him. She wanted him to understand exactly what he was dealing with. She wanted, and this was new, this desire to be fully known rather than safely hidden. She wanted him to know her, the real shape of her, the fear and the fracture lines and all of it. He listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not try to argue her out of her own experience. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she had not expected, something that bypassed every defensive structure she had built and went straight to the center of things. "Then let me keep making it worth staying," he said. "Not worth it because you owe me something. Worth it because being here is genuinely good, because we are genuinely good together. Let me show you that every day, and you can decide every day whether it is enough. I will not hold you against your will. I will not be Caulfield Mercer. I will just keep trying to be the reason the day is worth waking up for." She looked at him for a very long time. The April sky was enormous above them, that Wyoming sky that made a person feel both small and somehow expanded by the smallness. She felt something in her chest that was not a cage, it was more like a door, an open one. She said, "That is not a small thing you are asking of yourself." "No," he agreed, "but it is the right thing." She reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had reached for him deliberately, by choice, without the structure of an offered elbow or a steadying grip. He looked down at their joined hands with an expression she would think about for years afterward, relief and tenderness, and a kind of quiet ferocity, the look of a man who intends to deserve what he has been given. Spring became summer. The green deepened on the range, the grass growing thick and tall the way Wyoming grass grows when the winter has been wet and good. Lucy Donnelly continued to work at Elias Holt's store. She continued to live in the room behind the store. She continued to keep her bag packed, not entirely, but with the habit of readiness that did not immediately disappear just because things were going well. But she also continued to go out to the ranch on Sundays. And James Dunlap continued to come to town, more often than business required. And between those two things, the regular geography of her practicality and his persistence, something built itself that was sturdier than anything she had let herself have in years. He cooked for her one Sunday in May, in the ranch house kitchen, beef stew from a recipe his mother had written out for him before he left Illinois, with biscuits that he made from memory. It was not the best biscuit she had ever eaten. She told him so. He laughed and ate two of them anyway with what seemed like genuine satisfaction in the specific quality of his own cooking, regardless of the review, and she found herself laughing with him and thinking that she had not laughed like this freely, without calculation, in so long that she had forgotten what it felt like in her ribs. He showed her the horses. He had 6 of them, including a gray mare named Frances who regarded Lucy with a measuring eye the first time they met, and then, on the second meeting, leaned her great head into Lucy's hand with a surrender that James said was significant. "Frances does not do that," he said, with an expression that might have been approval or might have been wonder or might have been both. She began, on the Sunday visits, to learn small things about the running of the ranch, not because he taught her in any formal or pressuring way, but because she was curious and asked questions, and he answered them thoroughly and with the obvious pleasure of someone who genuinely loved the work and rarely got to explain it to someone interested. She learned about cattle breeds and grazing rotations, and the water table, and the unpredictable calculus of Wyoming weather. She learned that his 4 hired hands, Pete Albright, a man named Gus Sato whose family had come over from Japan 20 years ago, and who had been working cattle in Wyoming since he was 15, a tough and economical man named Carl Whitmore who spoke rarely and moved constantly, and a young cowboy called Dennis Reed who was from Texas and homesick, and hid it under a layer of cheerfulness. She learned that these 4 men were loyal to James with the particular loyalty that men give to a boss who treats them as full human beings rather than equipment. She liked all of them. She especially liked Gus Sato, who had a dry humor and a habit of appearing precisely when there was work to be done and disappearing again once it was finished, like a practical ghost. When she mentioned this to James, he smiled and said Gus had been working ranches in Wyoming long enough to have absorbed the landscape's economy of motion. She noticed and appreciated that none of the 4 hands treated her as an anomaly or a curiosity or a problem. They treated her the way James did, as herself, as a person who was there, which was a more straightforward dignity than she had received in many places. In June, a thing happened that brought the hidden danger she had been carrying back to the surface with a violence that turned her cold all over on a warm summer morning. She was working at the store counter when a man came in who was not from Carver's Creek. She knew everyone from Carver's Creek by that point. 3 months in a small town is enough to learn the faces. This man was a stranger, middle-aged, with a road-dusty coat, and a quality of attention that felt like it had an agenda. He looked at the store's inventory without much apparent purpose, and then he asked Elias Holt, in a casual tone that was not actually casual, whether there was a woman working here by the name of Lucy, brown-haired, from back east. Lucy was in the back room. She heard it clearly through the curtain. She stood very still and felt the cold move through her. Elias Holt said he had a woman by the name of Miss Donnelly working for him, brown-haired, and then Lucy heard the particular quality of his pause, the small recalibration of a man who was deciding what to say next. She came through the curtain before he could say more. She looked at the stranger directly and said, "Can I help you?" The man looked at her for a moment with the assessing quality of someone comparing a face to a description he had been given. Then he said he was looking for someone else entirely, made a vague gesture of apology, and left. Lucy watched him through the window get on his horse and ride south out of town. She went to James that afternoon. She did not wait for Sunday. She borrowed the Holt's pony and rode the 3 miles to the ranch, and she found James mending fence in the south pasture, and she told him what had happened, quickly and without embellishment. He listened. He set down his fence tool. He said, "Did he get your surname from Elias?" "I do not think so. I came out before he could." "Then he has a description, not a name." He thought for a moment. He could be one of Mercer's people. He could also be entirely coincidental. We should not assume one way or the other yet. She noted the word. This time he did not correct it. "I need to know if you want to leave," he said. "Not because I want you to, but because it should be your choice, and I need to know what you are thinking." She looked at him. She was standing in the south pasture of his ranch with the mountains at her back and the afternoon sun turning the grass golden. And she had ridden out here, to him, instead of packing her bag, and that told her something about where she was. "I am thinking," she said carefully, "that I am tired of running, but I am also thinking that I do not know if it is safe to stop." "Let me make some inquiries," he said. "I know a man in Cheyenne who was a county sheriff and who knows how to find things out quietly. Let me write to him before either of us does anything." She agreed. He wrote the letter that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Lucy beside him, and she read it before he sealed it, because he offered, and because the fact that he offered, that he thought it was right for her to see what was being said on her behalf, was the sort of thing that made her chest ache in a way that was not entirely grief. The reply from the Cheyenne contact took 11 days. It arrived on a Thursday, and James rode to town the moment Pete brought it in from the stage. He came to the store, and they read it together in the back room while Elias minded the counter with elaborate unconcern. Caulfield Mercer was in Kansas City. He had not made any formal attempt to locate his wife. His pride had apparently, as Lucy had predicted, made a public search unacceptable. The man who had come to Carver's Creek had been, as far as the Cheyenne contact could determine, a traveling drummer for a hardware company who had been looking for a woman fitting a different description for different reasons entirely. Coincidence. Terrible, cold-making coincidence, but coincidence. Lucy read the letter twice. Then she sat down on the wooden crate that served as a second chair in the back room and put her face in her hands, not crying, but pressing back the pressure of the relief with her palms. James crouched down in front of her. He put his hand on her knee. He said her name, and she looked up, and he said, "You are safe. Right now, in this moment, you are safe." She nodded. She put her hand over his. They stayed like that for a while, the two of them in the back room of a general store in a small Wyoming town in 1884, with the world going on outside without reference to either of them. And it was one of the best moments Lucy Donnelly could remember having in a very long time. A week later, on a Sunday at the ranch, he kissed her for the first time. They had been standing on the covered porch watching a thunderstorm move in from the west, the kind of Wyoming storm that announces itself with a wall of green-gray cloud and a quality of charged air that makes the horses pace their paddock. The first thunder rolled across the distance. Lucy turned to say something about the color of the sky, and James was already looking at her, and whatever she was going to say about the sky did not get said. It was a careful kiss. Not tentative. James Dunlap was not a tentative man, but careful, in the way he was careful about everything that mattered, deliberate and full of intention. She kissed him back and felt the storm come in around them, and the rain began on the porch roof with a sound like applause. But summer, for all its gold and green and thunder, also brought the thing she had been dreading. Not Caulfield Mercer, something quieter and more internal, which was in some ways worse. It started in late July, on a night when she could not sleep and lay in the small room behind the store listening to the summer dark and feeling, with horrible clarity, the weight of what she was doing. She was falling more deeply in love with James Dunlap every week. She knew it. The knowledge was not frightening in the way it once would have been, but the older fear, the structural fear, the thing that had been built into her by 2 years of running and before that by a marriage that had turned her home into a trap. That fear had not dissolved just because she was happy. It had gone quiet, but it was still there. She got up and sat at the small table in her room and tried to think it through the way she thought through everything, systematically, honestly, without the comfort of telling herself what she wanted to hear. The facts. She loved him. He loved her. He had shown her every day for 5 months that he was not Caulfield Mercer and had no intention of becoming him. She was still, technically, married. She could file for divorce from Wyoming territory after 1 year of residence, which would be in October. James had said nothing about marriage, not yet, though she had felt it in certain silences, the shape of a question not yet asked. She did not know if she wanted to be married again. She did not know if she could be something other than married to a man she loved this much and still call herself a person with integrity. She did not know, at the bottom of it, if she was capable of choosing permanence. If the part of her that knew how to stay was still intact after everything that had tried to take it apart. She sat with all of this for a long time, in the dark, in the Wyoming summer night, until the sky outside began to go gray at the edges and the birds began to talk in the cottonwood across the street. Then she picked up her pen and began to write. Not a letter to anyone. Just the truth as she understood it, the way her mother had taught her. Write it down. See what it looks like outside your head. Decide what to do with it from there. What she wrote, after 3 sheets of paper and the better part of an hour, was this. She was afraid. She had every reason to be afraid, but she was also undeniably in the best and most reciprocal and most honest relationship she had ever had. And the fear that she could not stay, the fear that she was too broken or too defended or too much herself to give someone what they needed, that fear was not the same as the truth. She knew the truth. She knew it the way she knew the sound of the creek in April versus the sound of it in November, by the specific quality of the thing, by its particular character. And the truth was that what she had with James Dunlap was real, and real things deserved a chance. She would not promise to stay. She was not there yet, but she would stop treating her own capacity for love as evidence of damage. She would stop preemptively punishing them both for a future betrayal that had not happened and might not happen. She folded the papers and put them in her bag. And then she went to work, because the store opened at 7, and Elias Holt was depending on her, and life in Carver's Creek went on regardless of the private earthquakes of the people living in it. The conversation in the doorway, the one that had opened this story, the one that had started everything and continued everything, happened not because Lucy was leaving, but because she had finally decided to be fully honest about the fear. It was August, a warm Wednesday evening, and she had ridden out to the ranch as she sometimes did on weekday evenings when the store closed early. She had found James on the porch, and they had sat together as the sun went down, and somewhere in the middle of the blue dusk, she had told him everything she had written on those 3 sheets of paper at 3 in the morning. She had stood up when she said the part about not being able to promise to stay, because she needed to stand, needed to be able to see a clear path to the door behind her, because she was speaking a truth that felt like standing on the edge of something, and she needed to know the edge was there by choice. She had her bag in her hand, not because she was leaving, but because she had brought it from the wagon and had not set it down, and now it was in her hand and it felt in the moment like what it always was, her freedom, her contingency, her exit. "I cannot promise you I will stay, James," she said, and he had said with the total simplicity of a man who had already decided everything that mattered to him. "Then I will keep making it worth staying." She stared at him for a long time. Her fingers were tight on the bag strap. Then she set the bag down on the porch beside the door. She let it go. And she walked back across the porch to where he was standing, and she put her arms around him. And he held her. And neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing left to say that was more honest than that. She stayed that night. She stayed the next day and the next. She sent word to Elias Holt that she needed a few days, and Elias, who was a perceptive man for all that he kept his perceptions largely to himself, said that was fine and not to worry about the store. By the end of August, something had changed in the tectonic structure of Lucy's fear. It had not gone, but it had shifted from governing force to manageable presence. She could feel it and still choose. That was new. That felt in its way like a form of freedom she had not had before, not the freedom to leave, which she had always had, but the freedom to stay without it feeling like a surrender. She moved to the ranch in September. It was not a dramatic move. It was practical and quiet. She told Elias she was leaving his employ with gratitude and genuine affection, and Elias said he had seen it coming since February and he was glad for her. She packed her bag, the same bag she had carried from Kansas City to St. Louis to Cheyenne to Carver's Creek, and she and James loaded what she had into his wagon, which was not much, and drove out to the ranch on a September morning that smelled like autumn and turned earth and the first hint of wood smoke from somewhere across the range. She put her things in the ranch house. She hung her mother's photograph on the wall in the room that became hers, in the practical sense, while the larger question of permanence was still being built toward. And she felt, looking at her mother's face on that wall, in that solid stone and timber house that James had built with his own hands, something her mother would have approved of. The courage to try. October arrived. The aspens went gold and orange on the mountain slopes. The cattle were fat, and the grass had been good, and James made the sale in Cheyenne that would set the ranch in solid financial order for another year and come back satisfied in the particular way of a man whose work has answered him back fairly. He brought her a book from Cheyenne, not a sentimental gift, not flowers or ribbons, but a book of natural history that she had mentioned once, weeks ago, that she wanted to read. He had remembered. He had gone to 3 different shops in Cheyenne to find it. She had been at the ranch for a month. She sat at the kitchen table with the book in her hands and looked at him across the table and understood, with the absolute clarity of a person who has stopped arguing with themselves, that she was home. In October, exactly 1 year after she had arrived in Wyoming territory, Lucy Donnelly went to the county courthouse in Cheyenne with James Dunlap beside her, and filed for divorce from Caulfield Mercer on the grounds of abandonment, which was the most straightforward legal path available to her under the Wyoming territorial statutes. Wyoming Territory had been the first place in the United States to grant women equal rights in a number of legal matters, which was one of the small but significant reasons it felt different to be a woman here than it had in Cleveland or Kansas City or even St. Louis. The clerk looked at her paperwork. He looked at her. He stamped the forms and told her the divorce would be finalized in 6 to 8 weeks if there was no contest. There was no contest. Caulfield Mercer, when notified by legal post, did not respond. The divorce was finalized the first week of December 1884. James asked her to marry him on the evening the paper arrived, confirming it. He did not plan it, or if he planned it, the planning was invisible, which was characteristic of how he did most things. They were sitting in the ranch house after supper, the fire going, Lucy reading and James working through the account books for the quarter, and he looked up from the account books and said simply, "Lucy, I would like to ask you to marry me." She put her book down. She looked at him. He was sitting at the table in the lamplight with the account books open and his reading spectacles on, and he looked utterly, specifically himself, and she thought, "This is the person I trust most in the world. This is the person who said I will keep making it worth staying, and then did exactly that, every single day without drama or demand, with the plain and steady commitment of a man who meant what he said." "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He looked at her with that look she had first seen on the creek bank in April, the relief and tenderness and quiet ferocity. He set down his pen and came around the table and sat beside her, and she took his hand, and they sat like that for a while with the fire speaking softly and the December wind at the windows, and it was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. It was real. They were married in January 1885 in the small Carver's Creek Church by a minister named Reverend Croft, who performed the ceremony with the spare dignity appropriate to the occasion. The church was full. Nearly the entire town came, because James Dunlap was well regarded, and because Lucy Donnelly had, in her 14 months in Carver's Creek, become something the town valued without always knowing how to articulate. She was the woman at Holt's who always had time for a question, who recommended the right book to the right person, who treated the Navajo woman who sometimes traded at the store with the same courtesy she extended to everyone, who had once quietly helped a young woman in difficult circumstances with information about her options that no one else in town had bothered to provide. Gus Sato stood up at the wedding as James's witness, which surprised some people and surprised nobody who actually knew James Dunlap. Mrs. Holt, who had become something approaching a friend, stood with Lucy. Pete Albright cried and was embarrassed about it and denied it entirely when questioned. The reception was at the hotel dining room, where they had had their 6 suppers. Someone had tuned the piano. There was dancing and cake and a quantity of whiskey that was appropriate to a frontier wedding celebration, and Lucy Dunlap. She would use the name because she chose to, because it was hers now and no one had forced it on her, danced with her husband on that slightly warped hotel floor and felt, in the movement and the music and the warmth of his hand at the small of her back, something she had almost given up believing she could feel. She was not merely surviving. She was living, and it was better. Winter settled in around the ranch, and they settled into married life with the same practical seriousness they had brought to every stage of the preceding months. James had always run the ranch with efficiency, but there was a different quality to the evenings now. The table set for 2, the fire shared, the particular domesticity of 2 people building their days around each other's rhythms. Lucy found that she had opinions about the arrangement of the kitchen that he accommodated without fuss, and he had habits of routine that she adapted to without resentment, and the negotiation of shared space, which she had feared might feel like constraint, felt instead like collaboration. She began to teach. This was not planned, but it arose naturally from the absence of a schoolteacher in Carver's Creek, which had become a real problem as spring approached and the school term needed to begin. The school board, 3 local men who met in the back of the hardware store, came to James first, because that was the habit of the time, and he listened to them and said they should come and talk to his wife, because it was her decision to make. They came to the ranch on a Sunday and talked to Lucy, who asked them 20 questions they had not anticipated and gave them a conditional yes. She would teach the spring term if the school board would ensure the schoolroom had adequate firewood, sufficient light, and books that were not 15 years out of date. They agreed to all of it, with the slightly stunned expression of men who had expected the negotiation to go differently. She taught 31 children from April through August of 1885, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Among them were 3 children from a Shoshone family that had settled near town, whose mother had to argue with the school board for her children's inclusion, and got it largely because Lucy had already told the board, flat and clear, that the school was open to all children in the district or she would not teach in it. Among them was Gus Sato's daughter from his first marriage, a solemn 12-year-old named Me, who was reading at a level 3 years beyond her age, and who Lucy encouraged with a focused attention that produced visible results. Among them was the Reeves boy, whose father was still the mean-natured man he had been, and Lucy watched that boy with a particular care, the watchfulness of someone who knew what it was to grow up in a house where the air was bad, and she made sure he knew that someone saw him clearly, and that what he saw in his father's house was not the only model available. That summer was the best summer Lucy Dunlap could remember. The work was hard, teaching 31 children and running a ranch household and keeping the books for the ranch, which she had gradually taken over from James because she was faster, and he was relieved. But hard work that is meaningful has a different quality than hard work that is just survival. She went to bed tired and woke up purposeful, and James was there at both ends of the day, solid and steady and funny in the dry, understated way that she had come to love specifically. They fought, occasionally. That was part of it. They were both strong-willed people with definite opinions about most things, and living in close quarters with a strong, well, not your own, creates friction sometimes. Their arguments were sharp and honest and short. Neither of them sulked or withdrew into silence as a weapon. They said the thing, and then they resolved the thing, and then they went on. And the going-on part had a quality of trust in it that Lucy thought was probably the most mature thing she had ever participated in. In the fall of 1885, she found herself sick in the mornings. She knew what that meant. She sat with the knowledge for 2 weeks before she told James, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted 2 weeks with it herself first to process the magnitude. She told him on a Sunday evening in October, with the windows showing the last of the sunset and the horses in their paddock and the mountains going dark to the north. She said it simply, without prelude. He looked at her. The expression that crossed his face was not complicated. It was purely and completely joy. He came across the room to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her the way she sometimes looked at the mountains, with the knowledge that something was beautiful and enormous and you could not take all of it in at once. "Are you happy?" he asked, because it mattered to him more than anything whether she was. "Yes," she said. "Genuinely and completely yes." Their son was born in the late spring of 1886, on a May night when the stars were thick over the Wyoming plain and the creek was running high from the snowmelt. The birth was attended by the doctor from town and by Mrs. Holt, who had delivered enough babies in her time to be calmer than anyone else in the room. James was in the next room, which was the appropriate arrangement for 1886, and Lucy could hear him pacing, which she found, in the middle of everything else going on, genuinely amusing. The boy was born healthy and loud, with his father's dark hair and his mother's sharp eyes, and James came in when it was done and stood by the bed, and held his son for the first time with the particular combination of terror and wonder that new fathers have always had, regardless of era, and Lucy watched him and thought, all of this is what it was worth staying for. They named him Thomas, after James's father, and added Robert as a middle name, after nobody in particular but because it sounded well with Thomas and James approved of it. Thomas Robert Dunlap arrived in the world in 1886 and immediately set about making his needs known with great efficiency, which everyone agreed was a Dunlap quality, though the specific efficiency of communication seemed to come from the Donnelly side. The ranch continued to grow. James had always been careful and strategic with the operation, and by 1886, the Dunlap spread was one of the most respected operations in the southeastern Wyoming territory. He bought an additional 200 acres along the North Ridge in the fall of that year, and Pete Albright, who had proven over 3 years that he had a genuine gift for cattle management, was made a foreman, which was a distinction James gave him with the same directness he applied to all things, and Pete received with the same self-consciousness he had never quite grown out of. Gus Sato's daughter Me, who had been one of Lucy's best students, came to the ranch twice a week through the winter of 1886 to continue her studies with Lucy, who taught her algebra and literature and geography by the kitchen fire, while Thomas slept in the cradle nearby. Misato was 15 by then, serious and capable, with an ambition that Lucy recognized the way one recognizes a quality you have shared. She told me, directly and without softening it, that there was no reason a woman could not do anything she set her mind to, and then she provided the specific practical information about how to navigate a world that would not always cooperate with that ambition. It was the most valuable thing she knew how to teach. The school board asked Lucy to take the position again for the 1887 spring term. By then, Thomas was nearly a year old and mobile in the alarming way of almost one-year-old boys, and the arrangement would require some creative logistics. James suggested that Carl Whitmore's wife, a capable and warm woman named Ada who lived on the ranch and had been offering to help since Thomas arrived, could take care of the baby during school hours. Lucy accepted the teaching position. Ada Whitmore took Thomas on mornings with an obvious delight that suggested she was getting the better of the bargain. Thomas, who had his mother's empirical nature, assessed Ada Whitmore in his grave and serious way and then pulled her hair, which she took as acceptance. By 1887, Carver's Creek had grown. The railroad spur had come through the previous autumn, which brought new commerce and new people and new energy. 2 new businesses opened on the main street. A second doctor arrived. There were enough children in town now that the school board was considering a second classroom, which Lucy thought was necessary and argued for at the next board meeting with the same combination of preparation and directness she brought to all arguments she intended to win. She won. The second classroom was added that spring, and a second teacher was hired, a young woman named Ellen Price, who had come from Missouri with a teaching certificate and a look of determined competence that Lucy recognized and liked immediately. She took Ellen Price under her informal wing, sharing what she knew about the students, about the community, about the particular demands of teaching in a frontier town where some children walked 4 miles each way, and some had fathers who thought education for girls was an unnecessary expense. At home, and it was home now, fully and without reservation, the word carrying its full weight without any of the lightness that comes from using it as a temporary description. At home, Lucy and James continued to build the life that had started with a conversation on a creek bank in April 1884. There were ordinary days and extraordinary ones. There were mornings when the light came over the eastern ridge and turned the whole ranch gold for exactly 20 minutes, the way James had described it when she first heard him talk about the place, and she understood now what he had been trying to say. It was not about the beauty of the light, exactly, but about the fact that it came every morning, reliable as faith, and that having someone to see it with made the whole thing more than you could hold alone. There were evenings when James came in from a hard day's work and sat at the supper table and talked through the day, and Lucy talked through hers, and Thomas banged his spoon on the table with the enthusiasm of a person who knows exactly what he wants to say but has not yet acquired the vocabulary, and the noise and the lamplight and the smell of supper, and the sounds of the ranch outside the windows. All of it was dense with life in a way that Lucy had spent years believing was not available to her. In the winter of 1887, something happened that resolved the last major open thread of Lucy's complicated history. A letter arrived from a lawyer in Kansas City, addressed to Miss Lucy Donnelly, and forwarded through a chain of addresses that eventually found its way to Carver's Creek, Wyoming. The letter informed her that Caulfield Mercer had died in November of that year, of a fever that moved through the Kansas City wards in the autumn, and that there was no estate of consequence. The letter was from a law firm that was apparently closing out his affairs and had located the divorce record, which is how they had found the address trail. She read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat with it for a moment, and what she felt was not grief, because she did not grieve him, and it was not triumph, because she had not been fighting him for years. It was something more like the closing of a door. The last thing that had been open-ended in her history had closed. She was not anyone's wife but James's. She was not anyone's missing person. She was Lucy Dunlap of the Dunlap Ranch in Carver's Creek, Wyoming territory, and she had chosen that every day by staying. She told James that evening. He listened. He put his arm around her. He said nothing that was more than the arm itself needed to say. Spring of 1888 arrived with the wild extravagance that Wyoming spring always had, the green coming up fierce and sudden after winter, the creek running loud, the geese back on the south bend. Thomas Dunlap, who was nearly 2 years old and had strong opinions about everything, developed a passionate attachment to the gray mare Frances and spent considerable portions of each day at the paddock fence communing with her through the rails. Frances accepted this with the same measuring dignity she had always applied to Lucy, which James said was a very good sign for the boy's character. Lucy was, in the late spring of 1888, expecting again. She was 31 years old, which she was aware was on the older side for a second child by the standards of the time, but she was healthy, and the doctor was sanguine, and she herself felt strong in the way that a person feels strong when their life is in order. She told James on the porch on a May evening, with the sun going down behind the mountains and Thomas asleep inside, and the ranch settling into the sounds of early summer night. He received the news with the same uncomplicated joy he had received it the first time, and she sat with her head on his shoulder, as the sky went from gold to rose to the deep purple that precedes the first stars, and she thought about all the things she had been afraid of, and all the things that had not broken the way she had feared they would. Their daughter was born in November of 1888, on a clear cold night with the first snow of winter coming down soft and thick outside the ranch house windows. She was born with her mother's dark hair and her father's October Creek eyes, and she arrived in the world with a quiet alertness that was different from Thomas's declarative entrance but no less certain. James held her in the lamplight and looked at his wife and said, "She looks like she already knows something." "She does," Lucy agreed. "She looks like she is deciding what to do about it." They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but because it was a clear and honest name that seemed to suit a girl who looked at the world with that specific quality of assessment. Clara Rose Dunlap, born November 1888, who would grow up on a ranch in Wyoming with a brother who loved horses and a mother who taught school, and a father who understood that the best thing you could do for someone you loved was make staying worth it every day. Misato, Lucy's former student, left Carver's Creek in 1889 for a teaching college in Denver, the first in her family to receive formal higher education. Lucy had helped her write the application. She had written the reference letter herself, spending 3 drafts on it to get every word exactly right. On the day Me left on the stage for Cheyenne, Lucy stood at the side of the road and watched the coach go and felt the particular pride of a teacher, which is the pride of watching someone become more fully themselves and knowing you had some small part in clearing the way. The ranch in 1889 was a different proposition than the ranch in 1883, when James had driven a young woman from town out to see it for the first time. It was still 600 acres at its core, but the North Ridge purchase had added 200 more, and the operation was profitable and well managed in a way that spoke to a decade of careful decisions. James was known throughout the southeastern territory as a straight-dealing man whose word was good, and the Dunlap cattle brought a premium at market on the strength of that reputation. But the thing James was most proud of, though he said it rarely, because he was not given to speeches about his feelings, was not the ranch's profitability or its reputation. It was what had happened in the years of Lucy's presence to the quality of the life on it. The bunkhouse had better food, because Lucy had quietly reorganized the cook's arrangements. The hands had Sunday afternoons fully free, which had become the tradition because Lucy had asked early on whether they always worked Sundays, and James had thought about it and made the change. The community of the ranch, the 4 hands, Ada Whitmore, the daily rhythm of the people who made the place work, had a warmth to it that James knew had been there in potential before and had been fully realized after. In 1890, Wyoming was admitted to the Union as the 44th state. It was the first state in the nation to enter the Union with women's suffrage already in place, carrying forward the equal rights provision that the territory had granted in 1869. Lucy Dunlap voted in the first state elections with James beside her, and she did it with a composure that was only slightly marred by the fact that her hands were shaking, which she would never have admitted to anyone but him. "Nervous?" he asked in the line outside the polling place. "No," she said. He looked at her hands. He did not say anything. He took the nearest one and held it. She voted. She came out of the polling booth and stood in the October sunshine and thought about her mother, who had taught school in Ohio and died without ever having this right, and about all the women before her who had argued for it and been told they were asking for the wrong things, and about the particular illogic of a world that had been structured to keep capable people from full participation in their own governance. She thought about all of this, and then she straightened her coat and went home, because there was supper to make and Thomas had a tooth that was coming in badly, and Clara needed her winter boots let out, and life did not pause for the profound. But she thought about it in the evenings sometimes, and she was glad. Thomas Dunlap, at 4 years old, was a specific kind of person, intent and observant, and physically fearless in the way of children who have spent their whole lives on a working ranch. He could already ride with someone alongside, and he talked to the horses in the private and purposeful way of a child who has decided animals deserve full conversation. He had, somewhere in the course of his 4th year, decided that Gus Sato was the most interesting person on the ranch after his parents, and he followed Gus around the property with the tenacity of a small and devoted shadow, which Gus bore with the same quiet competence he brought to all things. Gus occasionally gave him small, appropriate tasks, and Thomas completed them with enormous seriousness, and then reported the results to his mother with the detail of a man submitting a formal account. Clara, at nearly 2, was watching all of this with the assessing eyes that had been hers from birth, cataloging the world with an attention that Lucy recognized with a mix of recognition and amusement. In 1891, James Dunlap did something that surprised the county. He brought a case to the county court on behalf of the Shoshone family, whose children Lucy had insisted on including in the school. The Washakie family, father named Thomas Washakie, a cousin of the famous Shoshone chief Washakie, who had negotiated the Wind River Reservation treaties, whose water access along the eastern boundary of their leased land had been contested by a neighbor using legal pressure that was, in the estimation of any honest observer, a dressed-up version of the oldest injustice in the territory. James testified himself and had Lucy's testimony entered, and had the water access documented back 12 years, and the case was decided in the Washakie family's favor by a judge who, to his credit, read the law as it was written rather than as people wished it to be convenient. It cost James Dunlap some social standing among the men who thought the natural order of things should remain undisturbed. He accepted this without visible concern. The men who mattered to him, the ones whose esteem he had cultivated over a decade and who knew him as a man whose judgment was sound, those men did not change their view of him. And the Washakie family, who had been prepared for the worst, received the news with a dignity that James said later was a better character reference than any he could give himself. Lucy had been with him through every step of it. She had done the research, found the documents, written the summary of the case that his lawyer had used as the factual foundation. She had also sat with Thomas Washakie's wife, Marie, in the waiting period before the decision, and talked to her about things beyond the case, about her children, who were good students, about the year and what it held, about the particular business of keeping a family going in a landscape that required constant negotiation. It was a friendship, quiet and real. By 1892, the The Dunlap Ranch was home to a world that Lucy had not believed 7 years ago she was capable of building. Thomas was 6 and starting school sitting, with enormous propriety, in the schoolroom where his mother taught, which created a social complexity that he handled with the adaptability of a child who had always lived in a home where complicated things were dealt with directly. Clara was 3 and had developed a passion for the kitchen garden that Ada Whitmore tended through the growing season, and she spent her mornings in the dirt with the focused joy of a small person who has found their element. James, at 39, was a man who moved through his days with a quality of settled purpose that was different from the purposefulness of his younger years. He still worked as hard as he always had, but there was a rootedness to him now, a richness in the specific way he looked at things, that spoke to a man who knew exactly what his life was and was grateful for it down to the bone. Lucy was 35. She was still teaching, now in a school that had 3 classrooms and 4 teachers, and she had, gradually and without ever seeking the title, become the de facto head of the school's operation. The person the other teachers came to with problems, the person the school board dealt with because it was more efficient than the alternative, the person parents trusted with the complicated cases. She had cut her hair shorter, a practical concession to Wyoming winters and busy mornings. She had laugh lines at the corners of her eyes and a directness of gaze that had softened only slightly, only in the specific direction of the people she loved, without losing its essential quality of seeing things clearly. In the summer of 1892, she and James went for a ride along the creek bank on a Sunday afternoon, just the 2 of them, while Ada Whitmore watched the children and the ranch went on around them with its reliable industry. They rode slowly, not going anywhere in particular, following the creek where it bent south through the cottonwoods. The cottonwoods were in full summer leaf. The creek ran low and clear the way it did in August, showing the smooth stones on the bottom, and the air smelled like water and grass and the particular warm sweetness of high summer Wyoming. James pulled up his horse on the south bend, and they sat there in the dappled light, looking at the water, in the easy silence that they had always been comfortable in. Lucy looked at the place where the 2 Canada geese had nested 8 years ago, on the spring afternoon when James had said he loved her for the first time. The reeds were still there, different geese almost certainly, but the south bend was the same. "What are you thinking about?" James asked. "8 years ago," she said. "Standing here the first time." He was quiet for a moment. "You had your coat on," he said. "That brown coat, you were watching the geese." She looked at him. "You remember the coat." "I remember everything," he said simply, and she believed him. She was quiet for a moment. The creek moved over its stones. The cottonwoods made their light, constant summer sound. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited with the patience that was entirely his own. "I promised you nothing," she said. "In the beginning, I told you I could not promise to stay, and you said you would keep making it worth it. You have done that. Every day you have done exactly that." She paused. "I want you to know that I am not staying because it is worth it, though it is. I am staying because I cannot imagine any world in which I would want to be anywhere but here, with you, with Thomas and Clara and the horses and the creek and all of it." She looked at him steadily, with the full directness that had never left her. "That is as close to a promise as I know how to make, and I mean it with everything I have." He looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face was the one she had first seen at the creek bank in spring, and had seen countless times since, the relief and tenderness and quiet ferocity of a man who has been given more than he expected and is determined to deserve it. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they sat like that in the cottonwood shade beside the south bend of the creek, on a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1892, while the water moved and the world was good. And Lucy Dunlap, who had once stood in a doorway with a bag in her hand, and a rancher's impossible patience spread out before her like an open plain, Lucy Dunlap held her husband's hand in the warm summer light and chose, as she chose every day, to stay. Not because she had to. not because she was trapped or obligated or afraid of what leaving would cost her, but because James Dunlap, true to the word he had given her at the very beginning, had never stopped making it worth it. And that was the whole of the story and the best of it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a life. Thomas Dunlap grew up and learned the ranch from his father with the same tenacity he had brought to learning everything, and in time became a cattleman of no small skill. Clara Dunlap grew up with dirt under her fingernails and a library in her head, and an opinion on nearly every subject, which her parents both found entirely satisfying. Miss Sato came back from Denver with a teaching degree and a position in a school in Cheyenne, and she wrote to Lucy every month for 20 years. The Washakie family and the Dunlap family remained neighbors and something more than neighbors. The friendship forged in a difficult year and held through the steady accumulation of ordinary ones. And James and Lucy rode out along the creek in August for the rest of their years together, following the South Bend where the cottonwoods grew and the geese came back every spring, as they always had, as they always would, returning, staying, finding that the place was worth it. It always was.